In 1857, the Comanche Indians made a raid into Kerr County near Kerrville, Texas, and then they went back up the Guadalupe River Valley. Now, a party of 7 young men mounted their horses and set out in pursuit of these Indians. They were William Kelso, Spence Goss, Jack Harridge, Tom Wary, Dan Murph, Tom McAdams, and Newt Price. Now, all but Kelso were inexperienced in Indian warfare. He had been a Texas Ranger and should have been more cautious, and the terrible disaster which followed might have been averted. These men trailed the Indians to about 25 miles above Kerrville, and then they stopped to cut a bee tree. Now, at this time, the Indians were on a bluff near the creek, and they watched the white men until they left the place where the honey was found, and then they went into camp. This was ascertained afterwards by finding the place where the Indians had congregated on the bluff, and then following the trail to the spot where the unfortunate men had made their camp for the night. Their camp was in a thicket, and their horses were staked out in the open plain. The night was cold, and a bright fire was kept burning for some time, plainly indicating to the Indians the exact location of that camp. Now, the guns of the party were stacked around a tree several yards from the fire. About daybreak, Tom Wary and Dan Murph arose and rekindled the fire, and then taking their guns, went out to hunt a deer. The balance of the men also got up and stood or sat around the fire. At this time, the Indians had crept close up upon them, and before the white men were aware of their presence, had secured their guns and made the attack on the white men. Some of these men had revolvers, and these defended themselves as best they could. Now, Kelso shot an Indian down, and the Indian fell dead near the fire. The Indians made such a furious onslaught, and the settlers were so badly shot up at once, that they soon scattered into the brush, each man trying to save himself. Now, when Murph and Wary heard the fire in the camp, knowing its significance, they ran back to help their comrades. And Murph almost ran among the Indians, and stopping in an open place, discharged his gun at them. Now, almost at the same instant, he received a ball in the breast, and he fell dead on the spot. This shot was from some of the settlers' own gun. Wary was shot in the breast with an arrow, and after firing his gun, he escaped into the brush. Now, Spence Goss was sitting down by the fire with his feet drawn up close to his body facing towards him, and an Indian fired at him with a short Mexican gun called an escopete, carrying a large ball and 3 buckshot. Now, the charge struck the man in the right leg below the knee, broke the bone, and went on through the thigh. With a powerful effort, he dragged himself away into a thicket and lay down. Now, Kelso was shot crosswise through the small of the back with an arrow, but he jerked it out. Shooting an Indian down, he made his escape into the brush. Tom McAdams was shot in the neck through the windpipe with an arrow, but he managed to get away. Now, Newt Price was standing with his back to the Indians, and he was hit in the shoulders with a load of buckshot from one of their own guns. He also made his escape into a thicket. Jack Harridge was sitting by the fire with his shoes off, warming his feet, and only having a small single-barrel pistol called a Derringer, sprang away in flight without being hit. He was the first man to reach the settlement, but his feet were so bruised and lacerated by rocks that before they healed, the bottom of his feet had come off. Now, the Indians got all the horses except those of Murph and Wary. When they started on the deer hunt, they turned their horses loose to graze until they got back. They took fright during the battle. They ran away and made their way back to Kerrville. Sometime after the fight, when the Indians were gone, Kelso, Wary, and McAdams got together and started for home on foot, but they made slow progress. Now, Kelso could scarcely walk, and McAdams was constantly sick and vomiting, caused from swallowing blood from the wound in his neck. Wary was also badly wounded. The arrow made such a deep wound in his breast that as he breathed, the air would escape through the aperture with a whistling sound. They were several days getting back to Kerrville. Goss and Price both escaped into the same thicket, but were not aware of each other's presence. Both were weak from loss of blood and fainted, or as they expressed it, went to sleep and lay there for several hours. When Goss came back to himself, he again called out to his companions and was answered by Price nearby. These two now got together and went about a mile, Goss dragging one leg after him. Here they found a small cave and spent the night in it. Next morning, Price proposed, as he was able to walk, to try to make his way back to the settlement of Kerrville and send relief to Goss. He started but never reached there. He died 10 miles from where he had left his companion. In the meantime, search parties were sent out hunting for Goss and Price, not expecting to find either man alive. Goss remained at his cave 18 days, vainly hoping as each sun ran its course and went down to the west that before another setting sun help would come. Of course, he knew that his unfortunate companion lay dead 10 miles away, where he had sank exhausted to rise no more. No one else knew where he was, and the search parties had gone round and round his position. During the day he would crawl around the dense thickets and eat grapes and lie in the cave at night. A small spring branch nearby furnished him with water. He had his pistol but would not shoot anything for fear of attracting a band of Indians. After remaining in this condition for the length of time mentioned above, Goss gave up all hope that anyone would come looking for him, so he started off to the settlement of Kerrville, using a forked stick to aid him in getting there alone. After traveling several days in this way, he was found one day sitting down leaning against a tree by Judge Patton from Kerrville, who was out on a bear hunt. Patton helped him to get to the camp of a man named Miller, 8 miles above Kerrville. In the meantime, a party of searchers had found the trail of Goss and could easily follow it by the holes he made in the ground with his stick. They found him at Miller's camp, and then they conveyed him to the house of his brother-in-law, Joshua D. Brown. Now, Mr. Brown was the founder of Kerrville, which was named after James Kerr, relative of the Browns. Murph was buried where he fell in a shallow grave, but well covered up with rocks. Shortly after this, a runaway slave had come along the disinterred remains. He stripped the body and appropriated the clothing to his own use. Now, the slave was then placed the body back, but the wolves dragged it out again. Hunters found it and brought the skeleton to Kerrville and buried it there in the cemetery. Hunters also found the skeleton or bones of Price 2 years after this incident, and his boots with bones in them were brought back to town. So, now as far as Kelso, he drew the arrow from his wound during the fight and threw it down, but he failed to notice in the excitement of the time that the spike had failed to come out with a shaft. For 20 years, the wound would not heal until it was surgically operated on and the iron arrowhead was discovered and removed, and then the wound healed. So this is one of the many incidences that took place between the settlers and the Indians. And this incident was Comanche Indians in Kerr County, a true account of early Texas pioneers.